The oil industry is scared. The impacts of climate change are upon us, and oil companies knew decades ago that burning fossil fuels would warm the planet. A paper published in the journal Nature in March of 2026 by several Stanford University researchers quantifies the economic impacts of fossil fuel emissions, concluding, for example, that emissions in the US since 1990 have caused over $10 trillion in economic damages worldwide, what they call a conservative estimate. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Even if emissions were to go to zero today, the future economic damages from past emissions would be, as the researchers write, at least an order of magnitude larger than historical damages from the same emissions. What this all means for oil companies is massive liability. Their actions caused measurable economic harm to people. They knew that their activities would cause climate change, and they've spent decades dumping money into efforts to prevent emissions reductions. They're scared, and they should be. On April 23, 2026, Emily Atkin, writing in the Heated newsletter, and Darna Noor, writing in The Guardian, both reported on a bill introduced by Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and Republican Representative Harriet Hageman of Wyoming, dubbed the Stop Climate Shakedowns Act of 2026. Its purpose, it states, is to prohibit liability against those engaged in the mining, extraction, production, refinement, transportation, distribution, marketing, manufacture, or sale of energy for damages or injunctive or other relief from the use of their products and for other purposes. In other words, if this bill passes, it would strip Americans of their right to sue oil companies for many of the damages they've caused. A similar piece of legislation passed in 2005 called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which largely shields gun manufacturers and dealers from legal liability. Currently, there are lawsuits in courts all over the country attempting to hold oil companies and governments accountable for climate impacts. If the Stop Climate Shakedowns Act of 2026 passes, then those pending lawsuits will be dismissed as well. One of the first significant lawsuits of this kind is Juliana v. United States. My guest, Christi Cooper, made a documentary called Youth v. Gov about this historic case, filmed as it was moving through the courts. Christi has an interesting story. She studied science and earned a PhD in neuroscience, going as far as to become a professor in Sweden before leaving everything behind to go study environmental filmmaking. She became an award-winning documentary filmmaker, including an Emmy Award for cinematography. Youth v. Gov was released worldwide in 2022 when it premiered on Netflix. In this conversation, we dive into the Juliana case and the legal arguments against governments that fail to protect their citizens from the harms of climate change. Lawsuits against governments differ from those against oil companies, but they make similar legal arguments. In both cases, the defendants knew about the harms of climate change, but failed to take meaningful action to prevent those harms. The lead attorney in the Juliana case, Julia Olson, calls the climate crisis the biggest crime against humanity ever. Julia responded to this crime by helping these young people sue the government. Christi responded by making a film about what happened. I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. You can subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you will also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. I met Christi at an environmental filmmaking retreat at Sundance in 2018, when she was still in production on Youth v. Gov. We recorded this conversation on July 15th, 2021. Here is Christi Cooper. If you could just tell me where you grew up.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. My parents moved there when I was 3 years old, so that was definitely my home during the 70s of kind of growing up in this very, I don't know, kind of a hippie utopia world
Right.
of
With
being
monumental
right
nature.
there. Yeah, and being, right at the foothills, and I went to a school up in the foothills, and Mount Sanitas was our backyard and our playground and our recess, area. So definitely had an upbringing and a childhood of being in the mountains and being in nature and being in the environment, and that very much being like a focal point of activities and family time.
So in terms of your view of the rest of nature, it sounds like you had a lot of ecological consciousness. Is that right?
Yeah, and I didn't even know, I don't know that I necessarily would have identified that or known that when I was a kid, but looking back now, I really understand that those experiences that I had and the people that were in my life that exposed me to those kinds of experiences, it did set me up to have, I guess, a consciousness around the world that I'm living in, and to have, I grew up Seventh Day Adventist,
Oh, wow.
and that, back then, 40 years ago, I felt that the mindset. I'm no longer in the church, but I felt that the mindset, 40 years ago, environmental stewardship, or just stewardship of the planet, was very much a piece of the ministry, and understanding that that was where we could commune with God. That was where we could have our spiritual relationship, was in nature. And so it was a responsibility to us to take care of it. I think that's been lost. Unfortunately, over the last 40 years, I don't think that's at all a focus point of many religious communities, unfortunately.
Right.
But that was something that I feel blessed to have, had pastors and leaders in that community who definitely influenced me along that track.
Yeah, and I feel like the Seventh Day Adventists were some of the first folks in the U.S. to really take on vegetarianism. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually grew up not only vegetarian but vegan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I was growing up, I remember there was a Seventh Day Adventist church, and I don't remember why I know this, but there was always good vegetarian food around there. I don't even know why I was there, but I just remember it being like a vegetarian thing.
Yeah, we had all kinds of vegetarian restaurants in Boulder, that yeah, it was great. The vegan food was not as great then as it is now. It's definitely much easier, I think, to be a vegetarian and vegan.
Yeah, used to be bland.
Yeah, it used to be pretty bland.
Very bland. Definitely. Well, cool. That's super interesting. So from Boulder, you went on this long, circuitous path through academia, and I wonder where that started. Like, what were you intrigued by and excited about as a kid, and how did you try to pursue those interests in school?
Hmm. Well, as a kid, so originally when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a veterinarian. So I was always good in the sciences. I was really good in math. And my undergraduate degree was in microbiology, and I worked at the Colorado State University Veterinary Teaching Hospital for about 6 years through my undergrad and through my master's in microbiology. That was really my focus. I really was drawn to the medical world, and in particular with animals. Um, so that's kind of where I started out, I guess, and kind of what started my academic pathway. That brought me to Germany, where I was going to do my PhD in microbiology, and I started a program, did it for a year, and was kind of disillusioned, and was doing a project that was really boring and not very successful. It was like being on a cloning fishing experiment, and
Mm,
not really having a lot of mentorship or guidance. So I ended up quitting that, and really, there was a lot of self doubt at that point in my life, of questioning whether or not I was, built for that, or capable of that, or I didn't, maybe a PhD isn't for me, and
mhm.
maybe I'm not a scientist, and um, yeah, just not really uh, knowing the direction that I wanted to take. And so I quit science for a while. I went to cooking school,
Oh,
um,
wow.
worked in a restaurant in Germany, and then also realized that that was not the path that I wanted to be on. I missed the science world, and I missed the interactions with my academic colleagues, and kind of realized that I needed to maybe just find a different focus. So I ended up discovering this position at the university that I was, in the town in Regensburg, and I started my PhD in neuroscience. I kind of switched fields, and what was really intriguing to me about that was that the work and what I was learning about, and the research that I was doing, was really focused on humans. It wasn't just like an obscure thing that that I was experimenting on or researching or one tiny element, but it was really about what makes our brains work, neurodegenerative diseases, and how do stem cells fit into that, and how do they function. And so my work just felt really relevant to me, and there was a very human context to it. I felt like the work that I was doing was going towards a good cause. Um, and that was really exciting to me for a really long time. I did, basic research for 16 years in Germany and Sweden, working in the stem cell field and with neurodegenerative diseases and brain injuries. And that was really fulfilling work to be doing.
Yeah, and you went as far as to become a professor of neuroscience in Sweden, which
Yes,
is
I was an assistant professor. Yeah.
going pretty far along that path. And then you started making short films. So I wonder what the chronology is there. I was trying to figure that out. I saw that, you have some early projects in South Louisiana after the BP oil spill in 2010.
Mhm.
And that was particularly interesting to me because I was there too, making films in South Louisiana at the
Oh,
same
that's
time
interesting.
after the BP oil spill. But we never ran into each other. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about how you got into these early projects and
Yeah.
like where did the filmmaking side come from?
Yeah, it's actually that was kind of the I guess that story is the genesis of my filmmaking. I was working in Sweden at the time, and again in the stem cell field, and a lot of the research that we were doing, we were understanding as scientists that there was a need for communicating, and I think a lot of scientists do a pretty poor job. There's some really great science communicators out there, but in general, scientists are not taught to communicate about our work. We're taught to go in and do the research, to write about it to our own colleagues, right? That's what all
Yeah.
of our research articles are about, is to share the information with our other scientific colleagues. But there's not any kind of emphasis put on making sure that the work that we're doing is relatable to the public and that the general public can understand the importance of the research that we're doing.
And
And
I think you can say that about academia writ large too,
yeah,
because
yeah,
that's happened outside of science within academia as well.
definitely. And I think that's also kind of what's led a little bit to that, maybe that societal push against academia being like an elitist thing. And it's, I think it's some of the onus is on us as academics or researchers or scientists or whatever we're doing in academia, to make our work relatable to the general public so they understand where this public funding is going, and
Mhm.
what the work is that we're doing. And my work was so focused on brain health and brain rehabilitation, and there was a lot of interest in that in Sweden. And so I joined a EU, a European network, of other scientists. It was an interdisciplinary program. We had historians and social workers and people in the social sciences and psychologists, and just a really like broad range of academics who came into this project, to focus on public understanding and awareness of science. And we created science fairs and festivals that traveled around Europe, and
Mm.
where scientists would have the opportunity to speak locally, at museums or different exhibits about the work that they're doing with the public, for them to come in and ask the questions and to really get a better understanding of the work that we're doing. So that was
Mhm.
kind of the beginning of my work, of kind of diving a little bit deeper into the importance of communications. And then I also getting a little bit dismayed at the prospects of tenure and what all that looks like in academia. And as you know, John, it's like it's a tough world to be on a tenure track. And
Yeah,
um, in the sciences, it's still very difficult for women to get to the top, despite being in an incredibly progressive country like Sweden.
right.
And so I kind of started to look a little bit outside of academia, um, and to see what are the other options that I have, especially in the storytelling realm. And I
Mm.
found this really amazing program in Montana at Montana State University called, it's an MFA in Science and Natural History Filmmaking. I was like, a light went off for me, and I was like, oh my
Mhm.
God, I could, I never saw myself as an artist or a storyteller, but my grandfather and my uncle in Germany are both filmmakers. And
Oh, wow.
I kind of grew up, yeah, I grew up with this, having a lot of my father's side of my family being artists, be it photographers, filmmakers, storytellers. And I had kind of, I think, put myself in this science box and didn't
Yep.
see
So
that
many boxes.
I didn't see that there was an opportunity for me to use my skills in a different way until I saw this program. And so I came out to Montana and I visited the program, and then I decided to, wait for a year and kind of save some money, and then ended up moving out here in 2009. My husband and daughter stayed in Sweden, and uh, I started my MFA here, and I ended up staying. My daughter ended up eventually moving here to be permanently with me here. Um, but yeah, that's kind of what got me going. So I during grad school in 2010, when the BP oil disaster happened, my friend Devin and I, who was also in film school, we threw all of our film gear in the back of my car and we drove down to Louisiana. And like at that time, we still were both really focused on science storytelling. And so we were trying
Mhm.
to connect with scientists on the ground this was before the oil had come into the bay. And we were trying to figure out how can we help these scientists get the message out about what's happening. And so we went everywhere connecting. There were all kinds of public meetings and, venues, and we just went everywhere and put ourselves out there and volunteered any media exposure that we could provide. And we ended up going out with some scientists into the bay one day to do some water and air quality control. And the captain of the boat who took us out there and his brother, where we ended up having like these amazing conversations with them. And it turns out that they were from the Atakapa Ishak tribe in Southwest Louisiana. They live outside of the levee system in Grand Bayou, and in a village where the homes are still all on stilts, and they have to travel everywhere by boat. And they were doing captaining of these boats and driving these scientists around because
Oh, wow.
their shrimping areas had been closed down and they didn't have work.
Mhm.
And so that all of a sudden, Devin and I were like, "Oh my God, this is the story."
Yeah. Yeah,
Like
totally.
these are the people we should be talking about. It's the people on the ground who are, yes, the science is interesting, but without the human connection,
Mhm.
it's so hard for people, to really understand the implications.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
So they invited us to stay with them, and we ended up living in their homes with them for 3 weeks, and we went out on their very last night of shrimping with them and filmed their last night of shrimping before everything completely closed down. And we were there when the oil came in, and it was a really life-changing experience for me in so many ways. I think it was the first time that I truly understood what the fossil fuel industry was doing to marginalized communities. I
Mhm.
mean, you've been down there, you've seen the tens of thousands of miles of pipelines through the
Oh, yeah.
marshlands. Until I was out on the boats and saw those pipelines, and until we went up in a plane and saw, how all of these pipelines have changed actually the ecology of those marshes and the impacts that it's had to these people. I don't know. I don't think I like completely grasped what was going on until that happened. And then and on top of that, they are impacted by every single climate event that comes through
Right.
that region. And they're a marginalized, disinvested, disenfranchised community. And so that was really like a turning point for me, and kind of the me realizing what kind of stories I wanted to tell and where I wanted my focus to be. And I had been so focused on science prior to that that I think I had kind of turned off or just wasn't aware. I think I just wasn't, focused on the human aspects and the human condition and the experiences of people on the ground, and what people are fighting for and fighting against every day.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting you say you were kind of coming up against this tenure situation when you were in your neuroscience, world, and I always find it remarkable within academia how, um, in a lot of places, there's actual, like, open disdain for doing work that interfaces with a broader public. Like, it's often like looked down upon to try to communicate more broadly. Um, and it's always been kind of remarkable to me. Like I understand that that particular intellectual communities need to communicate on a particular level with one another. But to then totally dismiss getting that information out there is always shocking to me.
I think it's a mistake. I think it's a misunderstanding of what our role is, um, working in institutions that are publicly funded.
Right.
I think that we have a responsibility and an obligation back to our community and back to the public to share with them the work that we're doing and the work that their taxes are funding. And
Definitely.
I think that's a big mistake.
So you applied for this MFA program before you had even made any films. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
And they looked at your, like, amazing science background and they're like, "Well, you can learn how to use a camera."
Well, so that's the cool thing about this program is it was initially, so it started in 2000. So when I came in 2009, I was the ninth cohort. The first 5 years were originally funded by the Discovery Channel.
Oh, wow.
And the professor, Ronald Tobias, who started the program, the intention of this program was to bring in students or people with graduate degrees in the natural sciences and teach them how to be producers and directors of documentary, content. Their thinking was if they can bring more people with these scientific backgrounds into the science storytelling realm, then there will be a lot more, I don't know, maybe in-depth storytelling or connections, or you have people that are going to be maybe more fluent in the science world and be able to talk to scientists and have just a greater understanding, coming from the background that they've come with. So there was no expectation starting this MFA program that we knew anything about cameras, about sound, about storytelling, about any of that.
Oh,
You
wow.
know, Obviously we had to go through a pretty rigorous competitive process to get into the program, but they were actually very interested in my PhD in neuroscience. I was the first neuroscientist to go through the program. So I think
Oh,
that
cool.
was, something that they were interested in for their program. Um, but yeah, it was kind of liberating too to start like a new program and sit down in the classroom for the first day and go, I don't know. I don't know anything. Like, teach me.
Totally.
That whole, all of that, like, imposter syndrome,
Yeah,
you
totally.
know, like fear of not knowing something. Like, it kind of all just disappeared because I suddenly had permission to not
You
have to know everything and I could question everything.
you
And
don't feel like an imposter if you know nothing.
right, exactly.
You're not pretending to know anything.
Exactly. It was, like, incredibly liberating to walk in, you know, to that moment, and yeah, and they just put, cameras in our hands, right from the very first day, and, I was really lucky. I had a really great cinematography professor, Phil Savoy. He had shot for the BBC for decades, and he just taught us so many tricks of the trade. I had great writing teachers, and one of the things that I probably most value about the program was the ethics of filmmaking that we learned, and we
Mm,
did a really
mhm,
deep dive with Ronald Tobias, and really really examining the ethics of storytelling
mhm.
and going back in history into colonialism and the start of National Geographic Society and
Right.
whose story is it to tell? And like all
Yeah.
these things that I don't think that if you took YouTube classes on how to run a camera, I don't think you ever
Well,
learn.
even most film school classes,
Right.
having I'm teaching in film school now, and I've
Yeah.
gone through it myself. It's just not I you can find that discussion happening in film schools, but it's not like a universal thing. So your thesis project, at Montana State was called "Contemporary Advocacy Filmmaking: Campaigns for Change," and then you started doing all these campaign videos with advocacy organizations. Can you talk
Yeah.
about this work in school and how it parlayed into work with a range of advocacy organizations?
Yeah, I kind of took a stab, kind of off on my own in grad school. I still not very accepted. I think there's always been this fear of the crossover between advocacy and propaganda and where where do those lines cross?
Right.
And so I think, you can't really do advocacy filmmaking. That's propaganda. And I was really trying to push the envelope on that and push back on that. Um, and so my research and the films that I studied were really about films that I think were advocacy films because of the impact that they had. And it doesn't mean that those filmmakers went out, to specifically highlight a particular person or a group or did it on behalf of those people. But there's people and there's groups out there doing amazing work whose work needs to be highlighted.
Right.
So I was trying to like tease that apart and understand, what's the difference between falling into that hole of propaganda, versus actually creating a film that can create change and can be an advocate for an issue and build awareness and understanding around an issue to create change within society.
Yeah. Well, I'm totally there with you. I want to talk about this 10-part series you co-created called Stories of Trust, calling for climate recovery. Um, and at the heart of this is on one single day, which was May 4th, 2011, lawsuits and petitions by young people were filed in all 50 states, making pretty much the same legal argument that present and future generations have the legal right to a healthy atmosphere. And all these coordinated um, petitions and lawsuits made the same demands on government that they act boldly and quickly to reduce carbon emissions in order to guarantee this right to a healthy atmosphere. And
Mhm.
this series of shorts you made tells various parts of this story, focusing on a wide range of characters, mostly the young people who are plaintiffs in each case. And if you've seen Youth v. Gov, which we'll talk about later, you'll recognize several of the main characters from the film, only slightly younger versions of them. Um,
Yeah.
can you start by telling me a bit about the organization behind these lawsuits and actions, Our Children's Trust, and its founder and chief legal counsel, Julia Olson? How did you come to
Sure.
work with her and with the organization on this project?
Yeah, so this actually all stemmed out of grad school as well. My second year in grad school, I joined a project. Kelly Matheson, I think she may have been in the second cohort in the MFA program, and she came into the program as an environmental attorney, and
Mm,
then got her MFA in science and natural history filmmaking, and then she went on to work for Witness as basically a human rights attorney storyteller. And so she came back to MSU and presented this project that she wanted to do that Witness was partnering with Our Children's Trust. And she was looking for some of the grad students to come on this project and partner with her. So I applied for the position, got it, and ended up working with Kelly and some of the other MFA students on creating some of these shorts. And Kelly and I went on to work on a few more of them, just the two of us to kind of finish out that project. I continued on that project past kind of MSU's involvement with it. And as you beautifully made the introduction, these cases were all born out of these legal actions that were simultaneously deployed on Mother's Day of 2010. And this was born out of Julia Olson's kind of dream and inspiration and her understanding of the importance of using the legal system or the judicial system as a means of protecting these young people's rights. So her background, she was a earth justice attorney working on climate change issues, and she always tells her story of, she had been, fighting pipelines or fighting corporations or fighting fossil fuel industries. And it really felt like a whack-a-mole approach to her.
mhm.
She'd get one down and two more would pop up. And it was just kind of
Yep,
this
yep.
like never-ending process of trying to seek environmental justice through the courts. And she was at a conference one year and heard Professor Mary Wood talk about the public trust doctrine. And she's very steeped in knowledge about tribal law. and tribal sovereignty and water rights. And so this kind of plays a lot into the public trust doctrine, which is an ancient law that goes really back to Roman times, that states that the government is responsible for protecting the natural resources for its citizens and for future generations. It's not written into our constitution, but it's embedded in it. This doctrine that our waterways, our wildlife, our shorelines, these are all for public use, and they're to be protected as a public resource. And Mary, came up with this legal theory that the atmosphere is probably our most important natural resource, and that this should be also protected under the public trust doctrine. So her legal theory is called atmospheric trust litigation. And Julia heard Mary talking about this at a law conference. And so she went up to Mary after this presentation and said, I want to take your theory and put it to practice. And so Mary connected her with Dr. James Hansen, and also with a young person at the time, Alec Lors, who was a youth climate activist in California. So Mary connected, these people together, and this was kind of the birth of this realization that she wanted to represent young people, and she wanted to use this public trust doctrine as the basis of the legal theory that she would be using. And so these initial lawsuits across the country and petitions for rulemaking were based on the public trust doctrine. They were not constitutional cases, but they were based on the public trust doctrine, as well as, taking, like, for example, I live in Montana, and our Constitution is actually beautifully written to protect the atmosphere. Our legislators are doing a poor job at doing that, but the Constitution, what the wording is in the Constitution is really powerful, and it's really beautiful. Same with Vermont. So, Julia tried to kind of use these, and the very first federal lawsuit was filed in 2010 as well, with Alec Lors being the lead plaintiff. And that was a case, born out of the public trust doctrine, and stating that the government, had not acted on climate change. And to make a long story short, that first case was dismissed and did not go anywhere. And so Julia went back to the drawing board, with her legal team. And, after a lot of research and digging into this, they realized that this was actually a constitutional case. And their claim to the government is not that the government has not done anything, but it's that the government has actually acted in a way that is harming its citizens and harming future generations. So they came up with their, with this next legal argument that's the basis of this federal case that is told in my story, Youth v. Gov. And this is a constitutional case. It's a civil rights case. It's based on, the principles that the government is violating these young people's rights to life, liberty, property, and personal security through their willful actions in harming these young people, through their willful actions in locking us into into a fossil fuel based energy system, and creating the climate crisis. So it's been really interesting for me over these 10 years to watch this evolution of the legal system, of Julia's arguments, and the development of this Juliana case, and how it was born out of all of these other cases. It stands really on the shoulders of all of those other cases, some of which were successful, some of which were not.
Another video in your trust series is called The Climate Kids, which tells the story of a group of kids in Eugene, Oregon, who got together in 2013 to push the Eugene City Council to pass a climate recovery ordinance, which they did in 2014, making it the first of its kind in the nation. Can you talk about what a climate recovery ordinance is, and why this kind of passage of it in Eugene was significant?
I think what was so unique about this particular passing was that it was entirely youth-led. So the young people in Eugene, they came together, and they had the support of the mayor, Kitty Pierce, and she actually did some workshopping with them, and taught them how to speak before a council member, and how to give a testimony, and to testify before their elected officials. And Um, it was, it was a really coming together of individuals who were trying to help these young people. They brought on scientists who were able to, um, speak to. I think one of the really important parts is bringing in the best available science that is necessary in order for a city or a county to transition off of fossil fuels, and what that looks like for that particular region. So they had scientists that had provided all of this information and material, and brought this to the city council. And I think the kids were so persuasive and so, really influenced how these decision makers were thinking, that they passed this ordinance. And it was a really first of its kind. And basically, what a climate recovery ordinance is a commitment, and an implementation of policies by a city to reduce their carbon emissions to a certain percentage by a certain time frame. And I don't exactly remember what the statistics were or what the percentages were on the Eugene climate recovery plan, but it's all with the goals of, you know, returning back to 350 by the end of this century.
Hmm.
So whatever measurements and, reductions that they had to put in place at that point in 2014 is what was implemented into that law.
Gotcha.
And the city is held accountable for that. The courts, the they have every year an assessment, where they're looking at how they're doing and where they need to make stronger transitions and electrified buildings and et cetera. And it's actually one of the goals that we, would love to support around the country with our impact campaign, is really encouraging and supporting young people around the country to take similar actions in their own cities. A lot of this very successful climate, um, mediation and climate justice work needs to happen, locally.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of groundswell and opportunity to do a lot of this stuff locally. And I think if we can start to see kind of like a patchwork, of these kinds of things springing up all around the country, at some point there's such a groundswell of movement that the federal government has no choice but to make those systemic changes, and the industries and the corporations have no choice but to make those transitions.
Yeah, totally. Well, I want to talk more about your impact campaign a little bit later, but let's kind of get into the heart of Youth v. Gov. Um, so in 2015, 4 years after these climate lawsuits were filed in state courts, Julia Olson and Our Children's Trust filed a similar atmospheric trust litigation suit in federal court, Juliana
Mhm.
versus United States. The plaintiffs are 21 young people from around the US whose lives are impacted by climate change, and several of these plaintiffs appear in your earlier work. You began filming this next stage in the legal battle, but instead of making a series of short videos tied to a campaign, you began production on a feature length documentary film, which became Youth v. Gov. Can you talk both about this transition from the state strategy to a federal strategy and your transition to making a feature documentary about it?
So it's not necessarily that the state case has led to this new federal case, but it's more that Julia had this vision of this, kind of collective onslaught of these cases at the state level and at the federal level, all happening simultaneously. Because the first case had been dismissed in 2010, and there were several years in between of going back to the drawing board and, coming up with their next best approach, or a better approach, I should say. There was this time lag between. So in 2015, in August of 2015, when these 21 young plaintiffs filed this new lawsuit, I was kind of poised, and I had already built this relationship with several of the plaintiffs. I had a relationship with Julia. I had spent this time understanding the legal doctrines and atmospheric trust litigation, and doing all this background work. So when they had their first win in the courts in April of 2016 with Judge Coffin ruling in their favor, that was kind of the moment that I realized, I'd always envisioned this being a bigger story, but there was never the right time or the story elements. And
Right.
this for me felt like the right moment. And so I contacted Julia and said, hey, I would really love to follow this long term, and will you give me exclusive access to cover this story from the legal standpoint, and working with the plaintiffs, and um, would you give me this kind of access that I would need in order to tell a feature documentary? And she agreed. And I think a lot of that was because of the relationship that we already had and the trust that she had with me, and she'd seen me over the years working with young people, and Julia knew that was the standards and the ethics that I brought into my filmmaking as well, and she felt very comfortable with me working with the plaintiffs, and trusted me to know when to turn off the camera, and
Hmm.
what kinds of elements are appropriate or not appropriate. So that was kind of the genesis, I guess, of this newer story that I spent the last 5.5 years, almost 6 years, working on now.
Yeah, and making a film about a legal case is always a huge challenge for a bunch of reasons. The timeline can be stretched out over many years. You may not be able to film in the courtroom. The case might get dismissed. Um, and one thing you've done beautifully in Youth v. Gov, in some ways to get around these problems of following a lawsuit, is to create portraits of each of the 21 young plaintiffs intercut with the legal proceedings throughout the film.
Mhm.
And documentary portraits connect us to these young plaintiffs as people, and they connect us to the land and the places where they've grown up, showing us in each case the impacts of climate change across the country that are happening right now. Can you talk a bit about how you approach the storytelling and the production of the film in a way that made it so engaging and visually rich?
Well, thanks, John, for those compliments. Um, it was a long process. I initially went into this knowing, I think I just intuitively knew that the plaintiff stories would be the heart of the story. Um, and I also knew that I wanted to present the legalities, the courtroom story, the case in a way that people would learn something. So I kind of went into this with two goals in mind, of wanting to connect people to the heart and to these young people, and to be inspired and moved by these young people taking action, and standing up to their government and understanding what their rights were. So
Yeah.
I started off working with as many of the plaintiffs as possible, and documenting their stories, and as climate impacts came, such as with Levi, would hop on a plane and try to follow Hurricane Matthew and what was happening to him, with him, Levi being evacuated from his home, or the wildfires in Oregon that many of the Oregon plaintiffs were experiencing, and felt, you mentioned the lawsuit, following a court case can be really challenging, because you don't know when things are happening, how long it's going to take, et cetera. And I had the added burden and challenge of never knowing when a climate catastrophe was going to hit.
Yeah, right.
And or where it was going
I'm
to
familiar
happen.
with that challenge making films in the Gulf Coast region. It's just like, "Oh, a hurricane's coming. I wanna go film it. Oh, but there's a hurricane, so I can't even get there."
Right. How do you get there? How do you protect yourself? How do you protect your crew? Everything becomes like a, survival moment, and you're trying to step into that to capture a story. So there was just a lot of unpredictability with this entire project, with this entire film. But I spent the first few years just trying to document as much as I could, many, many miles and hours spent in my car, with my gear. I had really great film colleagues and friends who came along and supported me and helped me on productions when I had very little funding or none at all to pay them. But a lot of it was me by myself, often setting up the audio and setting up the cameras and doing the interviews and building these relationships with the plaintiffs and with their parents and their siblings, and trying to stay on top of things as the court proceedings were happening. And so, we come to the end of this, and the case is still not finished, as people will learn when they watch the film. But I think about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I guess, we realized that we needed to, like, we don't know how long the case is going to go, and this story is too important to not get it out there in some way. So we decided that we needed to start on the post-production process. And so in
Mm.
October of 2019, that was when we went into post. And I brought my two amazing editors on board. I had a fellowship and in-house residency fellowship with the Jacob Burns Film Center, and I was able to bring my two editors there. They lived with me in the house for the month, and that's really where the story really started to take shape. I had done a lot of writing along the way, so I had a really good sense of the story that I wanted to tell and the elements that I wanted to be in there. I knew that this historical piece was super important. I didn't know that going into this story. I myself did not even know all of this history of our government and our presidents and the actions that they took. That was a learning experience through research along the way in making this film.
Right.
And so it was really important at some point in this capturing of this story to build my research repertoire and, the materials that we were working with, so that we could tell that part of the story, because it really felt like the background to the case. That also became part of our historical story, was understanding how movements in time help to shape our understanding of the law, and that our understanding of our constitutional rights also is shaped by our experiences and what we're learning through our society and as our society grows. So that also became an element of it. And, I really have to give a lot of kudos to Lyman Smith, one of my editors, when we were sitting down and starting on this storytelling, and we had all of our sticky notes all over the wall in the living room and trying to piece what are our three acts and how are we breaking the story up. And I kept harping on the fact that I really wanted to bore down on standing and like, what do you have to prove in the court of law in order to actually have a constitutional case? And, and I really kept insisting that, like, this has to be part of the film. People have to understand what these plaintiffs are having to prove in a court of law. And of standing. And our first act is based on the plaintiffs having to prove in a court of law that they've been harmed. The second act is proving that the defendant has caused that harm. And the third act is okay, these three storylines that I have, right? These plaintiff stories, the court story, and this historical story that I think a lot of funders up until that point it was the biggest criticism I had when trying to raise money for this film was, Christi, you're trying to tell three stories. Like, you need to pick what your story is and focus and, hone this down. You can't tell all of this in a story. Either you're telling a court case or you're telling a story about the plaintiffs or whatever, but it's all too much. And I really had in my head that I wanted to somehow figure out a way to combine them. And so when we came up with that 3-act structure, it kind of allowed everything else to fall into place for us story-wise, because we suddenly understood that the plaintiff stories and the historical stories and what was happening in the case, they all were going to feed into this 3-act structure that we had built out. Any plaintiff story needed to move the case forward, right? So the plaintiff stories came in at moments when we were trying to either show harm or try to show responsibility or try to show where the courts got it wrong, et cetera. And that was a super helpful, I guess, tool or trope for us in figuring out how to weave this very complicated story together with these three very different elements. One investigative, one all heart, one all legal and intellectual. And I think, from the feedback that we're getting, I think it seems to have worked.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant job of editing. You weave so much together, but it's so clear. And that is so hard to achieve. And, you use graphics really powerfully and it's clear without feeling heavy-handed at any point. It's just you're just taking us through the story and connecting all the dots. It's really beautifully edited.
Yeah, I follow 21 plaintiffs, but unfortunately, not all their stories make it into the final film, and I
Right.
think that was something that was really heartbreaking for me,
Yep.
was just realizing that I couldn't, you know, put this big light on every single one of them.
Yeah.
And
There's
I had to pick and choose which ones were moving the story forward. And that's really hard. I mean, we had 200 hours of original footage and about 300 hours of archival footage. And um, it's hard to cull that down in a way that you don't feel like you're losing the heart and the meat of the story.
right. Yep. Yeah, for sure. And you have develop these close relationships with people, and
Yeah,
they give a lot to you, and then to say, "Well, you landed on the editing room floor,"
it's
you know,
horrible.
it's horrible. It's one of the things I hate about filmmaking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's really hard. Someone who did make it into the film is Kelsey Juliana, who's the named plaintiff in the lawsuit, and she was also the subject of one of your earlier profiles on state suits. Can you tell me a bit about Kelsey and her story and what you saw as she, like, literally grew up in front of your lens? It's kind of amazing to see this evolution of a lot of these characters.
Yeah. I met Kelsey when she was 15, back in 2011, and she just turned 25 last month. And it's been a real privilege and an honor, um, to have this close relationship with her. She calls me her climate mama. Um, and she really does feel like a daughter to me. Yeah, Kelsey is she's a really unique spirit. When I first met her when she was 15, she was this bubbly, precocious, very self-confident and smart, teenager who just really had her head on straight. And she has this wonderful family who has supported her in everything that she's wanted to do, and every direction that she's wanted to go. They themselves were environmental activists, and I think in the beginning were very, very fearful of Kelsey being in that role. And I remember spending a lot of time with Tim and Katya, making them feel comfortable and trusting of the process. And they had been in films during their environmental protest years, and they knew the implications. They were very cautious and very protective of Kelsey having some of those similar experiences. But they really let Kelsey lead on that. And this is what she wanted to do. Kelsey was really generous with us and sharing so much of her life and her dreams and her disappointments. And I always could rely on Kelsey, to uh, be there as kind of the older sibling to the other plaintiffs in situations, and kind of create that warm camaraderie and family feeling when everyone was together. It just kind of happened naturally, and she was such a leader and such a caretaker of
Mhm.
these other plaintiffs that she just kind of naturally fell into that role. And I think it had less to do with her being the oldest one and the named plaintiff, and just more to do with her personality and who she is as a person. And I've seen her struggle. I've seen her struggle to get through school and to finish college. She just graduated last month, and I'm so proud of her. I know it's been a really hard and onerous path being an activist and being, a face to a movement and having so much demanded of you. And she's given up so much and sacrificed so much. She was going to school out in North Carolina and really loved the liberal arts school that she was going to. And she made the decision to come back to Eugene, Oregon because of her climate work and because of her involvement in this case. And that was a huge sacrifice, for her. For all of these young people, there's the psychological and mental anguish of working in this space in the climate world and seeing how unbelievably slow the work is, and how frustrating the courts are, and how disillusioning it is to have your own government fighting you on an issue like this. I think it's been a real challenging experience for all of these plaintiffs. And it's been hard to see them go through those struggles and those challenges and the heartache and the sadness. And there were a lot of moments of tears in making this film, and October 2018, when their trial was delayed several days before it was supposed to happen. It was unbelievable heartache. And, but Kelsey's always been able to pick herself back up again and find this joy in life and joy in the people around her. And she's just incredibly loving and accepting and gracious. She wants to be a teacher. She went to school to be a teacher, and she's been working with young people for years now in camps and in schools and doing all kinds of internships. And so I think she's well on her way to being one of our next best educators out there in the world. And I'm just so proud of her.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, she's really a remarkably sympathetic and radiant presence in the film. It's so important too when these big lawsuits pick somebody to be the face of the issue.
Yeah, and it's been an interesting experience seeing all of them become kind of find their footing in those roles and seeing them become more comfortable public speaking and, honing their talking points and becoming more resilient as well. And knowing how and when to call upon their support networks. I think it's really great to see these young people understand the need for that.
So when Juliana v. United States was filed in 2015, Obama was president, and soon, as you talked about earlier, the fossil fuel companies joined the suit to kind of help in the defense. Then Trump became president, and the fossil fuel companies dropped out of the case. I don't know if that's connected.
In 2015, when the plaintiffs filed the case, very shortly afterwards, the entire fossil fuel industry filed a motion to intervene in the case, which was quite incredible. It was these 21 kids against the entire, the government and the entire fossil fuel industry. So they for several of those years were fighting alongside, the government in this case. And then when Trump was elected and we were going towards trial, so this was all in the lead up to the October 2018 trial. Several months before that trial, I think it was in the summer, the fossil fuel industry and the government were supposed to both present their discovery in the case. And the fossil fuel industry repeatedly refused to present any of their discovery. And so pretty much at the last minute, when their deadline was over and they were supposed to present discovery, that's when they filed their motion to leave the case. They knew how culpable they would be if they had to present all of their discovery. So they literally only came into this case to make sure that they could help get it dismissed. They had no intention of ever truly defending the case, truly defending the evidence, truly going to trial and having their day in court. The entire intention was for obstruction and confusion. So when the moment came where they were actually being held responsible and were being asked to present the discovery, they said, nope, we're out of here. And that's when they left.
Oh, wow.
And to tell you the truth, I mean, it kind of helped the case a little bit because this case was not about the fossil fuel industry. It's not a case against the corporations or the fossil fuel industry. It's a case against the government. And so by them leaving the case, it really helped to bring the focus back onto the government and the role that the government played, right? The fossil fuel industry is doing everything that they're doing because the government's allowing them to, because they're subsidizing them, because they're permitting all of the infrastructure, right, the research, the consumption, all of that. So them leaving the case was actually, in my opinion, much better for the case.
But how, it was the plaintiffs who sued the government. How can they sue the government and then the fossil fuel industry jumps in and is like, actually, we're the defendants. We're going to insert ourselves here.
Isn't that crazy?
How does that work?
Well, I don't think it's that uncommon in cases to have interveners. And the interveners they're basically asking the courts to let them be defendants because whatever decision comes out of this case is going to impact them. They have a vested interest in the outcome of the case.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of how that works. And that's similar. I don't know if you want to jump to where we are currently in the case right now, but the same thing is happening right now again, where, suddenly we're going into this new phase of the case. And now there's also, again, this is all stemming from the fossil fuel industry. These states' attorneys general who are taking this on are all very steeply connected
Right.
to the fossil fuel industry. We know that this is their ultra conservative agenda, and the Juliana case is now, part of this agenda, apparently. So it's
Yeah.
going to be interesting to see. We don't know yet if Judge Aiken's going to allow them to be interveners. We don't know if the Biden administration is going to say we do or we don't want to work with these interveners. It doesn't look very great for the Biden administration to take the same stance as these 18 ultra conservative Republican states. So I don't know. It's a very interesting turn of events right now that's happening in the case.
Yeah, totally. So in January of 2020, after 5 years in the courts, the Ninth Circuit Court dismissed the case, but the ruling still left some ambiguity. Um, here's what Judge Andrew Hurwitz wrote in the opinion. The plaintiffs have made a compelling case that action is needed. It will be increasingly difficult, in light of that record, for the political branches to deny that climate change is occurring, that the government has had a role in causing it, and that our elected officials have a moral responsibility to seek solutions. We reluctantly conclude, however, that the plaintiff's case must be made to the political branches or to the electorate at large, the latter of which can change the composition of the political branches through the ballot box.
I'm glad you brought up that quote.
Yeah. So in other words, the court's saying there's a strong case here, but they believe that the executive and the legislative branches, they should be the ones to address the problem of climate change, not the judiciary. And after this ruling comes down, you have this gut-wrenching cell phone footage of several of the plaintiffs, the young plaintiffs who you focused on in the film, reacting to this decision. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your reaction and the reactions of the others in the film to this ruling.
Well, first of all, I want to say it's incomprehensible for me how the courts could rule and tell young people who can't vote that they're supposed to take this argument to the ballot box.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. It's
I mean,
kind of absurd.
It's
Totally absurd.
It's the most disenfranchising way that you could possibly address a problem. And it's where they got it so wrong, right? This is the whole point of why these young people have taken this case to the courts, is because they don't have political power. They can't vote for the vast majority of them. None of them could vote when the case started. We do not represent. Young people are so disenfranchised within our government and within our society, and the constitutional rights of children are pretty much ignored in this country.
Yep.
And so I think that was probably the thing that was the most disheartening and unbelievable about that decision of where they got it wrong, is telling these young people that they need to take this problem to the ballot box, and also telling them that they need to take it to the executive branch and to the legislative branch, when those branches to date have not done anything. And not only have they not done anything, they have put legislation and policies into place that have made the problem worse. Courts acknowledge that climate change is real. And I want to say that again, in no courts at all is there a debate about climate change.
Right.
So the courts, completely acknowledge that climate change exists and that these young people are being harmed by government actions. How do you rectify this if the courts don't see their role in protecting the most vulnerable citizens from harm by their own government?
Let's step back just a little bit, because before there was the ruling, there was the final arguments, and that really makes up the climax of your film, which is quite remarkable. So I just want to talk about that for a second. So Julia Olson is arguing the case before this 3-judge panel on the Ninth Circuit Court. The court has allowed video of the proceeding, and the video is being simultaneously played on giant screens outside the courthouse for this huge crowd of supporters, which is pretty remarkable. For oftentimes judges just shut all that down. And then in addition to that, you got this amazing footage of Judge Hurwitz, one of the three judges, going back and forth with Julia Olson. He's very sympathetic to the case, even in this back and forth before the ruling comes down, but asks whether it's the role of the courts to decide. And in response, I thought it was really interesting that Julia brought up Brown v. Board of Education, which was, another monumental lawsuit that many Americans were not ready for or happy about. But by declaring discrimination unconstitutional, the court gave redress to people who were being harmed, and in particular children, who the court, and the courts tend to hold higher standards when it comes to protection of children. But I feel like this whole question of like Brown v. Board really gets at the heart of the matter. You can kind of tell with the judges, Judge Hurwitz in particular, he doesn't want to overstep. He's very a lot of judges in our judiciary are very hesitant to what they see as legislate from the bench, and that's this huge question of whether the courts should force a change before there's widespread consensus on it. So I was just curious about, how has making this film impacted your thoughts on the role of the courts in bringing about change? It's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we wait for cultural shifts, or do we say no? Like half the country might not be on board, whether it's about segregation, or abortion, or climate change, or any other really controversial issue. But just because half the country is not on board, that doesn't mean we can't say, this isn't right.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I like the movement is here, right? The society is asking for these changes. There's such an urgent, we how many climate change marches have we had now? How many young people have been marching on the streets demanding action, here in the US and around the world? It's like climate change and climate justice is definitely on the forefront right now. And as we know from history, that was often what was needed, or went along with very important court decisions. But in this case, from what I've learned in following this story and the research that I've done, the courts are there. They're specifically, one of their biggest roles is to protect American citizens from direct harm by the government. When the other two branches of government are acting in ways that are harmful to its citizens, the third branch of government is supposed to be there to protect, to stop, to intercept, whatever that action is, that's their role, is to protect American citizens from that harm by those other two branches of government. And we are at the point with the climate crisis where that kind of protection is needed. It is absolutely clear, without a doubt, provable in a court of law. There's so much evidence showing the role of the government in creating this crisis and continuing to put the youngest generations in harm's way. And so I just have a hard time understanding why the courts, don't see their role in protecting that most vulnerable population from the actions of its own government.
So we now have a third president on the defense side of this lawsuit, and this time it's the Biden administration. And there's some talk, you alluded to this earlier, there's some talk about the Biden Justice Department negotiating a settlement with the plaintiffs, which is a huge change in direction from the kind of fight to the death approach of the Trump Justice Department. And now these 18 states led by Alabama are jumping in and trying to stop the Biden White House from agreeing to any kind of settlement. Can you explain a bit more about what's happening now and what the stakes are?
Sure. So Judge Aiken, when she set a date for the plaintiffs to have their hearing around their motion to amend the case, meaning they wanted to put the focus onto the declaratory relief part of their complaint that they're seeking remedy for. She at the same time ordered the Justice Department attorneys to meet with the plaintiffs for the beginnings of settlement discussions. And those settlement discussions were to start to take place prior to the June 25th hearing. Those discussions are completely confidential, so I know nothing about how they're going or what's being discussed or where the government stands and what kind of, how they're coming to the table. But what I do know is that the same Department of Justice attorneys who were defending this case under the Trump administration are the same attorneys still on the case under the Biden administration.
Oh, wow.
And we know that they're taking, in terms of the motions that they're filing in the courts, outside of the settlement discussions, we know that they're taking the same stance that they were under Trump. The question now is this really what the administration wants? Is this really what the Biden administration's stance is? Because we know that the Justice Department is working so independently from the administration, as it should. But unfortunately, the Trump administration kind of screwed that whole theory up, right? By wheedling their way into the Justice Department and having the Justice Department basically working for him.
Well, and getting all the career people out of the way who are supposed to keep the various departments pseudo nonpartisan. They're never going to be completely nonpartisan, but the career people are supposed to balance that a little bit.
Right. And so now we're stuck with this situation of, yes, we want the Justice Department to be an independent entity, but at the same time, there's all these individuals in there right now that Trump put in that have a very specific agenda. So we don't know if the Biden administration even knows anything about Juliana. We don't know if it's on their radar. We don't know if this is the stance that they actually want to be taking on the case. And with these 18 Republican states now wanting to intervene in the case, they're wanting a seat at the settlement table with no intention of settling the case. They're coming into these negotiations in incredibly bad faith, all spurred on and supported by the fossil fuel industry. So, the Biden administration now has this opportunity actually with these settlement discussions to, take the science that the scientists are saying needs to happen, come to the table with the best available science, and come find a solution that's a court-supported resolution where he can implement the progressive climate agenda that he wants to implement. He doesn't have to go through Congress or through the House to do this, right? He can do this through the courts with a court-supported resolution by coming to the settlement table and working with the plaintiffs on this. And that would be a settlement that no subsequent administration could undermine. A subsequent executive order by another president could not change that. Subsequent legislative actions could not change that. So it's really this huge opportunity. And I think that's in part why these Republican states are fearful of settlement. Mm-hmm. But the question right now is Biden even involved in the settlement, or are any of his priorities or, what the progressives are wanting on climate action, is that even taken into consideration with this? Or is this still the Trump administration, DOJ, completely single-handedly, controlling this case? I think it's interesting optics for the Biden, if the Biden administration actually chooses to take the same stance as these 18 Republican states and say that these young people have no constitutional right to a livable future.
Right.
What do we do with that?
Yeah. And my last film was about the Keystone Pipeline, and we were shooting in 2012 when it was Obama who was the one promoting the pipeline.
Right.
And we like to talk about the differences between the parties, but I think it's important for us to make noise about these things because, of course, the Biden administration doesn't want to be seen as acting the way Trump did. But if nobody jumps up and down and screams about it, and there are no articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post about it, they're not necessarily going to pay attention.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of the work that we're trying to do right now with the film is, to get this film into the Biden administration and to,
Mm,
some of his key members and officials and make them aware of this case. I think the film, they may have heard about the Juliana case at some point, but have very little understanding actually about it. And I think if they could watch the film, they
mm.
would really have a deep understanding of what this case truly is about and what their role could be in turning the ship
Yeah,
urgently.
totally, totally. So one thing I find interesting in the opinion of the Ninth Circuit Court is that they say there's a strong argument presented in the Juliana case, but the voters should decide how to address climate change, not the courts. And another way of saying that is addressing climate change requires a cultural shift, a change in the hearts and minds of American people to be successful. And so much of environmental activism has depended on making these rational arguments about why we need to protect ecosystems and environmental health. Science and law are kind of quintessential rational approaches to environmental action. The science clearly shows us the problem, and the legal system provides a clear mechanism for relief to that problem. Except we're not simply rational beings. You're a scientist, and you've spent about a decade following legal battles to
Mhm.
address climate change based on science. But you're also a filmmaker and a storyteller trying to reach a broad audience on a more emotional, affective, and kind of in some ways non-rational level. What have you learned through this process about social change and maybe about the limits of rational approaches?
Well, interestingly, I think people are not swayed by facts. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but we've learned definitely through climate communications that, over the last several decades, that to some degree facts don't matter.
Yeah, right.
And it's depressing for me, I think, as a scientist. It's depressing for me as a storyteller to understand that.
Terrifying.
Yeah. And I think, I've learned quite a bit over the last few years about deep canvassing and the role that deep canvassing can bring to helping to change people's opinions. And I think that those same approaches can be applied across the board to whatever the issue is to whomever we're talking with. And so I think it involves, I think being able to sway people or to get people engaged on issues has a lot more to do with talking to them about their values and understanding what their values are and what moves them and trying to find some common ground with them that way rather than hitting them over the head with facts and data and science and telling them how they're supposed to think and believe about things. And I think there's been some really great research and evidence that's now showing that these conversations around connecting with people around their ideals and what matters and speaking to the human part of somebody is a much more effective way of creating change or reaching those goals. And so I think about that as a filmmaker, I think about that with my storytelling and the bits that we put into the film. And yes, we do have a lot of facts and a lot of evidence, but I think really what the bottom line is that it's humans being impacted by climate change. And I think these human stories and the plaintiff stories and I'm sure that those are a much more motivating force and a much more connecting way to reach an audience than simply the facts.
Right. Can you tell me about the impact campaign for Youth v. Gov? And for those not familiar with the documentary film world, maybe also explain a little bit about what an impact campaign is.
Sure. Well, first, I'll start out by saying that not every film needs to have an impact campaign. I think that there's a lot of amazing films out there and documentaries that filmmakers have made never with an intention of having an impact campaign, and that's completely fine. And then there are other filmmakers, such as myself, who want to put stories out into the world that can help to create change or move the needle on a topic. But our goal really with this film and the impact campaign that we are going to be launching is we have a North Star, and that North Star is to hold the government accountable when it comes to the climate crisis. And we want all of our work to be focused at the end of the day on that, and for all resources and tools and tactics that we use to lead towards that action. And so we're very much looking forward to working with communities, and in particular young people and in disenfranchised communities, to give them resources and platforms and tools for how they can hold their government accountable. And by government, that can mean anything from their local school board, elected officials, to their city council members, their county council members, their state representatives, all the way up to the executive branch, empowering communities to understand that they have a role in shaping our democracy and in using their voice and their persuasion to create change locally and on the ground, within their own systems, understanding their own communities, and working to create that change with their own decision makers. That's kind of going to be the focus that we're of what we're doing with the film. Excited to be working with local nonprofits on the ground to use the film as a tool for them to implement that work, as well as working, nationally with other organizations on national campaign, and also working, kind of behind the scenes, in a government affairs kind of role of, trying to work on the Hill and within the Biden administration to do as much outreach around the Juliana case as we can, and petitioning for our government to uphold the rights to children for a safe and stable climate. And so a lot of our work is going to be, all of our work is going to be focused on that.
And what does kind of trying to get to the Biden administration, or to get in dialogue with the Biden administration, what does that look like?
Well, it's so far proving to be quite challenging.
Yes, I'm sure.
They have so much on their plate right now, and so many
Yes.
people who are...
A few other things happening.
There's a few other things happening, and there's a lot of priorities, and there's a lot of, groups trying to push through various agendas. And we have so much dysfunction in this country right now. And I'm sympathetic, to how much this administration has on their plate. But I think at the same time, we're really trying to press upon them the urgency of this issue, and they don't have time to waste. And I think also once our government officials and decision makers start understanding the intersectionality of climate justice, or maybe put better, how much climate change impacts so many other areas of our lives,
right,
from health to infrastructure to, resources, to food security, to national security. There's all of these other issues where climate impacts are going to and are already, greatly impacting a lot of that. So, the outreach that we're doing right now is with climate influencers, with folks who have connections within the administration. We're really trying to connect with as many of those folks as possible and press upon them the importance of the Biden administration understanding what Juliana is. We would love for as many of those people to see the film as possible, to feel educated on the case. We're going to be working with some youth groups, who will hopefully be organizing some in-person screenings in DC with their representatives. We're hoping to work with an impact producer on some congressional screenings, but really with a lot of the focus, at the top with the Biden administration. It's slow work. It's a lot of outreach and, connecting with the right people.
Well, good luck with that. I know how hard that stuff is, and it's hard to raise money to do it.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thinking broadly about science, law, and cultural change, what have you learned through your life and work about how we can more effectively protect the rest of life on the planet?
Well, I think I've learned through storytelling that talking about things and sharing stories is really critical, I think, to that change. I think the issues that we care about and the issues that are pressing and important, we can't stop talking about them. But I think we can, intergenerationally find a lot of solidarity on issues by working together in that way, and uplifting other voices, and passing the mic on to other people whose voices need to be heard, and providing those platforms for them, or giving them a seat at the table and making sure that they're leading the way.
Yeah, has your view of the role that science or law play in that process evolved?
I think the science is all really important, but I think they also need to be talking about it. And the scientists need to learn how to communicate it, or they need to bring on communicators to relay that information. And yes, I still think the law and the legal system is incredibly important. I have not given up on that. I think it's such an important part of our democracy and how our government should and needs to function. Um, so I definitely think both of those still play a huge role in moving forward, in particular with climate justice.
Right. Yeah, well, thinking about your film and the Juliana lawsuit, regardless of whether anything comes of it that's concrete, um, the amount of change it has left in its wake is pretty remarkable. I mean, there's your film that tells the whole story and brings awareness to a big group, but then there are all these 21 young people and then other people connected to them whose lives are forever changed by this, and they're going to go on to do other things. So even if a lawsuit doesn't succeed, it doesn't mean that it hasn't contributed to an overall process of change and of bringing things into the daylight that we weren't talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, as Nick said in the film, this case can serve as a beacon of hope to other lawsuits, and even if they don't win, it's it has started the conversation, and it's the first constitutional climate change lawsuit. It's the first lawsuit of its
Right.
kind, and certainly not the last. And so it definitely does serve as a beacon of hope, and an example to other new environmental attorneys or constitutional attorneys to start looking at our constitutional rights in a different way, or looking
Right.
at environmental justice in a different way, and really linking, our environmental rights as a civil right. And I think those conversations weren't happening 10 years ago, and that's something that I'm really encouraged by, and something that I think this case has really helped to spur on that conversation.
Yeah, and we're always looking for that big victory and and that very clear step forward, but, you just gotta keep chipping away at it because, and hope that over the long term, you are moving forward even if it doesn't feel like it all the time.
Absolutely.
So thinking back on your view of the rest of nature when you were a kid, how do you think those views have changed through your life?
I've carried that experience as a child, being in the woods and being in the mountains and being on a peak. um, those have definitely been feelings and emotions, I guess, that I have carried with me through my life, and other experiences in nature. I don't think they've changed a lot for me in my life, because I did feel such a deep connection as a child. I think they've become something that I feel much more protective and urgent about. And, I think a lot of my feelings around those special places are, you know, the blinders have been lifted, and I think feel a lot of sadness and loss around that. But definitely, still have such a strong connection. It's my
Mhm.
church. Those being out in nature and being surrounded by that, by clean air, by clean water, by being able to hear the birds sing, and a lack of industrial noise and cars, and um, the daily goings on. It brings such a peace and focus into my life, and it's definitely the place where I'm able to find, like, my spiritual center. and to be able to refocus or regenerate or heal. So it's definitely a huge part of balancing out my life with the
Yeah.
work that I do.
So I've asked you to bring a quotation to read that's been particularly meaningful on your journey in life. Could you end the show by reading what you brought and telling the story of its significance to you?
Sure. And I feel like it's such an unfair request to make. It's like, so I feel like there's been so many powerful quotes and poems and, you know, like amazing quotations that I've heard in my life that have influenced me or moved me. But, my focus over the last years has really been around justice and around our rights, as human beings. And so there's a quote from John F. Kennedy that really resonates with me. He said, "The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened." And I think that really speaks to me on so many levels. It doesn't matter what the topic, what the theme is that you bring to it, whether it's, the right to marry or to love who you want to love, or the right to live in a clean and healthy environment, or the right to be safe from gun violence, or, any of these rights are, if one person is threatened by those things, it should take all of us to fix that and rectify it and protect those people. And it really brings it home when you think about just how a single person is impacted, and what their life might be due to actions that I take or others take, and how my life can, and the decisions that I make and the actions that I take can be in the service of trying to protect that one person, even if it's one person that I'm trying to protect. It's worth it. It's worth that work.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a beautiful way to end. And thanks so much for all your time today. I really appreciate it. It's been so great diving in.
John, thanks so much. This was an amazing opportunity, and I really enjoyed, diving deeper into this story. And I'm humbled that you wanted to tell my story, and I hope that we can tell your story at some point. And I really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you so much for listening to the Chrysalis podcast. Please subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you can also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. I want to send a very special thank you to all of our paid subscribers. Your membership allows us to grow, flourish, and remain free and ad-free for everyone. Your belief in the work that we're doing and your generous support mean the world to me and the podcast team. Thank you.